Hello, I'm Jeffrey K. Mondello, editor of the Boston Catholic Journal. Today, I have a very urgent question for you. In fact, I believe that it is the most urgent question of our time. 30, perhaps 20 years ago, most Catholics would have considered it a rhetorical question. That is to say, a question in which the answer is already implied, a question the answer to which is so obvious that we dismiss it outright. But no longer. The question, in fact, is not mine at all, and for this very reason, it deserves our attention and a very careful consideration. It is this. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And of course, it is a question asked by Jesus Christ himself. In St. Luke 18:8, imagine, Christ actually asked this question, and we must answer it. What will we say, given the scandalous state of the Church, and the even greater scandal within the papacy itself today? No more stunning, no more incriminating, and perhaps no more ominously portentous words are spoken in all the Gospels. In fact, in the entire New Testament, perhaps even in the entirety of sacred Scripture itself, words that have become increasingly fraught in significance with every passing year of the most appalling, the most perfidious papacy of Francis. A papacy not just likely, but I believe certainly, will be understood not simply as among the worst, but the worst, the most destructive to the faith and to the Church in the annals of 2,000 years of Church history. Indeed, with every generation following the devastation wrought by the Second Vatican Council, that scorched earth assault on tradition and historical Catholicism, the question increasingly verges on a frightful and frightfully clear answer. If our reply is not an outright no, then at best it will be very little. Indeed, we must wonder if the question that Christ poses, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth, is in fact spoken of this generation, or of one soon, very soon, to come. As with so many of Christ's teachings, this troubling question is too often and too deftly explained away, especially by the overwhelming number of liberal theologians and bishops who have proliferated and multiplied since 1962, which is to say, by the learned and the wise. If we heed them, then it would appear that either Christ does not know what he is saying, or we do not know what he is saying, although we all agree that he said something that sounds suspiciously clear. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? These 12 words we must pay careful attention to, perhaps more now than at any other time in Church history. However reluctant we are to take Christ at his word, which is often inconvenient to us, we must recognize that Christ never spoke idly. His words, his teachings, and yes, his commandments were always uttered to one explicit end: the salvation of souls, attaining to heaven and everlasting happiness and to avoiding hell and eternal misery. The Jewish religious authorities, the learned of his own time, had scornfully dismissed Christ's warning that not so much as a stone will remain standing in the great temple, the very temple within which 70 years later these words were fulfilled when Rome laid waste in days what took 46 years to build. We tend to view such alarming statements by Jesus, and there are many, with the same scorn and disdain today. A mere 50 years ago, we ourselves would have instinctively replied, "Of course you will find faith. There simply must be some deeper, some obscure and less evident meaning to this that we do not presently understand. And what he appears to be saying, he is not really saying at all." Surely the learned of our own day can deftly explain the answer to this troubling question. In the end, they will conclude Jesus is really asking something entirely different from what he appears to be asking, and that it has nothing to do with our very real defection from the faith. In other words, to us, our faith, the faith of the Holy Catholic Church for 2 millennia, could no sooner disappear than, well, the stones of the great temple 2,000 years ago. If, however, we take careful inventory of our present and undeniably dismal and increasingly scandalous situation in the Church, especially as it has unfolded in the last 5 decades, Jesus does not quite appear as perplexing as so many apparently make him to be. Candidly ask yourself the following. Has the faith, the Catholic faith, flourished in the last 50 years, or has it withered? Are vocations to the priesthood and religious life growing or dwindling? Are Catholics having more children, or are they having fewer children? Are more Catholics going to Mass now than they did 50 years ago, 30 years ago, or less? Our missionary efforts to the end of, dare we say it, conversion, as mandated by Christ, encouraged as intrinsic to Catholicism, or are they discouraged as impolite, obtrusive, culturally imperialistic, and inherently inimical to the ecumenical spirit of Vatican II? Especially as interpreted by Pope Francis, for whom proselytism is solemn nonsense, to use his own words. Words that, if we really reflect upon them, mock the sacrifices, the deprivations endured, the hardships suffered for the sake of bringing souls to Christ and his church, and thus to everlasting happiness, of countless missionary saints through the 2,000 years preceding Vatican II's more enlightened understanding of the Great Commission. A new understanding demanded by Francis that we needn't bring anyone to Christ. Indeed, that we must not. And why not? Because it would be an infringement upon the ecumenical agendum in which all religions suffice to bring us to God, despite everything that Christ taught us about being the way, the truth, and the life, apart from whom no one goes to the Father. Those are Christ's own words. Who then are we to follow? The heretic Francis or Jesus Christ himself? Tell me, who do you choose to follow? The true shepherd or his unfaithful steward who has torn down the gate of the sheepfold that the wolves may mingle with and prey upon the sheep? Francis's mandate is an explicit denial of Christ. We find that conversion to Christ and his church is actively discouraged, that under Pope Francis it is no longer understood as a holy and inherently necessary endeavor. Instead, it is disdained, even dismissed, as socially and culturally incorrect. Indeed, we find that promoting our Catholic faith, as Christ commanded us, has been forbidden by Francis and his progressive coterie of feckless and disaffected cardinals and bishops. What pope prior to Vatican II could ever have envisioned this? Is our understanding of the Catholic Church as an absolutely unique institution indispensable to the ordinary means of salvation even emphasized at all today? Indeed, is the concept itself of the singularity and indispensability of the Holy Catholic Church still deemed an actual dogma and a viable concept at all? Not, it appears, in Francis's essentially post-Catholic conciliar church. For all our insolence and equivocation, we know the answers, and we are uncomfortable with them, for they fly in the face of Christ and all that he taught, to say nothing of sacred scripture, holy tradition, and the sacred deposit of the faith entrusted to the Catholic Church by God himself. Indeed, Christ's question takes on a greater sense of urgency still, for the shepherd, for the sheep are scattered and confused as never before. The papacy of Francis has been disastrous for the Church. Why did it come to this? Precisely because he has taken Vatican II to its logical conclusion: the irrelevance of the Church. Who is earnestly addressing this spiritual malaise and religious decay due to the indolence and dereliction of the vast majority of American and European bishops, who appear far more eager for secular plaudits than for the now quaint and discredited notion of the salvation of souls? Pope Francis has effectively declared this mandate defunct in favor of the rehabilitation of bodies, societies, economies, and the environment. That the passing material environment of man is infinitely less important than the eternal abode of his soul, despite his sanctimonious rhetoric, appears to elude Francis. Indeed, it appears to elude most Catholics, whose mantra increasingly coincides with the world: social activism, not interior conversion, away from this world and to Christ. Shame. Shame on us. By our silence, our fear of being disparaged by other Catholics for the sake of Christ, we condone this travesty. We are complicit in it, even promote it. What will motivate us to recognize and to redress this frightful and ultimately deadly state of affairs? There are, after all, other contenders in this world for the souls of men, seen and unseen. As our own wick smolders, others blaze. The burning crescent of Islam, poised like a scimitar, and every bit as deadly, glows and grows in the east, and with it not an ethnic, but a religious cleansing to which the world remains indifferent, an expunging of every vestige of Christianity in patibus infidelium, that is to say, in the lands of the infidels. And even Islam has its secular collaborators. The European Union, once a continent raised up from utter barbarism to a civilization formed and ennobled by its Catholic heritage, will no longer tolerate the inclusion of its inexpugnable Christian heritage within its constitution. Not only does it thoroughly repudiate its own Christian cultural heritage, it prohibits it, even banishes it. This is nothing less than self-loathing, and given this disdain for Catholicism, it ought to be. Surely then, in our effort to remedy this impending state of dissolution, we will first turn to our bishops, since they are preeminently the teachers and guardians of the faith. But more often than not, much more often than not, in the well-appointed office at the end of the corridor, we do not find a shepherd of souls, but a deeply sequestered, occasionally avuncular, and predictably remote administrator. Relegating his prime responsibility as teacher and promoter of the faith to others in the form of lay committees and subcommittees, largely chaired by liberal Catholics more concerned with social issues than the salvation of souls, are we really confident that the patrimony of our faith will somehow percolate through the strata of already contaminated soil and reach our children authentically and intact? Really, we beg the question. If no one teaches the teachers, who then teaches the children? If they are not taught the faith by those to whom it has been entrusted, our bishops, our priests, and our now professional religious educators, who have succeeded the teaching sisters that once taught out of conviction and love, but had been decimated, effectively extinguished since Vatican II turned its back on them. Who will bring it to them? If the transmission of the Catholic faith to our children is only a secondary, or much more likely a tertiary concern of those to whom it has been entrusted, how likely is it to bring our children to Christ, to his church? Will they, how can they, acquire the faith if no one brings it to them intact? St. Paul is very clear about this in his letter to the Romans. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? Or how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they be sent? We must ask ourselves candidly, do we know more or less of our Catholic faith than our children? Very likely more, although in all honesty, it is probably less than we should know. What then, we must ask, with growing apprehension, will our children teach their children? What will they, who know even less than we do, teach those who know nothing. The momentum we see is inexorable until it culminates in total ignorance. Every generation knows less of their faith than the generation preceding it. It is, in the end, the devolution from doctrine to legend to fiction, and from fiction to myth. That is not just a poor, but a stultifying and ultimately deadly patrimony. This default at every level in transmitting the authentic Catholic faith intact leaves Jesus' question suddenly very real. The problem is more than mathematical. As we have seen, it is exponential. 70% of Catholics do not possess the most fundamental, that is to say, the most essential understanding of the core article of genuine Catholic doctrines. That, for example, unless you eat of the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in you. It is not just a matter of the greatest concern, but nothing less than a matter of the gravest dereliction that most Catholics do not realize, do not know, that the very Mass itself is an abbreviation of the most holy sacrifice of the Mass, in that it is really a sacrifice, the actual reenactment of Calvary before our very eyes. This failure of understanding culminates in a failure in faith. It possesses in significant ways the remorseless characteristics of mathematical certainties, not understanding, grasping, having never been taught the most elementary tenets of the faith. How can they be understood to possess what they have not acquired? And how can they transmit, pass on, what they do not possess? It is inescapable. Prognostication, of course, is for fools, but the words of Christ are certainties that will come to pass. Weep not for me, but for your children, Christ told the sorrowing women on the road to Calvary. Jesus' question then, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth, is not a rhetorical question at all. It is a question fraught with enormous significance, the frightful answer to which appears to be unfolding before our very eyes. But that is only if you take Christ at his word. And given Christ's track record on things yet to come, we would do well and wisely to give pause for more than thought. Are you worried now? Not nearly enough. And this is all the more frightening still. If not for yourself, then for your children, take Jesus Christ very seriously. Take his teachings in the Gospels very, very seriously. For at the moment, no one in Rome is. Custodia te Deus.